At 9:47 a.m. on March 18, 1945, Private First Class Danny Reeves crouched deep inside a shallow foxhole near the Rur River. 200 yards ahead, 3 German snipers held his entire company pinned to the frozen ground. 47 American soldiers. No artillery, no air support, just open terrain. And 3 rifles that had already taken 6 lives that morning. In the next few minutes, Reeves would attempt something so risky, so completely outside Army doctrine, that his commanding officer would threaten him with a court-martial, right before ordering him to teach the technique to every combat engineer in 3rd Army. Reeves did not learn problem-solving from military manuals. He learned it deep underground in the coal shafts of Scranton, Pennsylvania. Down there, pressure wasn't theoretical. It was literal. You learned to think when the ceiling creaked, when the air thinned, when hesitation meant disaster. Danny followed his father into the anthracite mines at 14. By 16, he could set blasting charges with almost automatic precision, calculating fuse burn times by touch rather than sight. Foreman called him reckless. His father said he was simply efficient. The Army enlisted him 3 days after Pearl Harbor. He turned 18 during basic training at Fort Belvoir, and the moment they read his mining background, the decision was obvious. Combat engineer. But Army mine warfare doctrine had been written by men who had never belly-crawled through a collapsing tunnel with 60 seconds of air left. The official manuals insisted mines were strictly defensive tools. Bury them, map them, wait for the enemy to wander in. Danny watched too many men die following those rules. February 12, 1945. Sergeant Mike Brennan was laying a textbook minefield outside Durham when German mortars opened up. He died with a mine still in his hands. February 23rd, Corporal Jimmy Hayes tried to clear a path through a German mine belt. A hidden teller mine detonated under his knee. Medics collected him over 40 feet of frozen ground. March 3rd, Private Tommy Sullivan, Danny's closest friend, argued that planting anti-personnel mines along a tree line was pointless, that the Germans would simply skirt around the field. His lieutenant refused to change the plan. Sullivan obeyed. 6 hours later, the Germans bypassed the mines, flanked the position, and shot Sullivan in the back as he tried to retreat. Tommy showed Danny a picture of his little sister every night, spoke constantly about opening a small garage after the war, repairing Fords and Chevrolets somewhere quiet. After his death, Danny stopped sleeping well, stopped trusting doctrine. He started studying the battlefield like he once studied rock seams underground. Angles, distances, risks, hidden cracks waiting to be exploited. The flaw in American mine tactics was obvious. They were static, predictable. The Germans were too experienced to step into neatly patterned minefields. They scouted them, mapped them, walked around them. Danny began to wonder, what if mines didn't have to sit still? What if they could be delivered like a thrown charge, aggressive, targeted, unexpected? He tried once to explain this to Captain Rhodes, describing the idea carefully, respectfully. The captain looked at him as though he'd suggested surrender. Mines are defensive implements, Private. We follow the manual. Danny let the conversation end, but he didn't stop thinking. During marches, while digging new foxholes, while cleaning his rifle at night, he kept repeating the same question. Could a mine be thrown? Most mines weighed too much. The American M1 anti-tank mine was 20 pounds, completely impossible to throw. But the German shoe mine, the shoe mine engineers often carried as captured equipment, weighed barely 4 pounds. Compact, lethal enough to take off a leg or blast open a bunker door. If the fuse could be shortened, if the timing was perfect, if the rotation stayed stable, then maybe, just maybe, it could work. March 17th. Night settled cold over the Rur pocket. The company had pushed within 300 yards of the river, but German sniper fire made any daylight movement suicidal. Artillery shells were being saved for the main assault. The men were stuck. Danny cleaned his M1 carbine in the dark while Lieutenant Mackey briefed the squad leaders. 3 sniper positions, 2 in a farmhouse, 1 in a church bell tower. Clear sight lines across the entire American approach. A sergeant muttered that crossing the open ground at dawn would be a death march. Mackey agreed, but said those were division orders. Danny couldn't listen anymore. He stood up. "Sir, I might have an option." Mackey sighed. "Reeves, unless you've learned how to fly, sit down. I can take out those sniper positions. Tonight." Silence washed over the group. Danny explained, not every detail, not the fuse cutting or the physics, just the essentials. Using captured mines, modified deployment, a stealth approach under darkness. Mackey stared at him for a long 10 seconds. "That is the most reckless plan I've heard in this entire war." "Yes, sir." "You will almost certainly be killed." "Understood, sir." Another pause. Then Mackey surprised him. "You have until 400. If those snipers are still shooting at dawn, you better pray the Germans kill you before I do." At 11:15 p.m., Danny slipped into the supply depot, found crates of captured German explosives, and selected 4 intact shoe mines. He checked the fuses, 8-second standard, far too long. He needed 3, maybe 4. Just enough time to ignite, throw, and reach the target before detonation. Regulations were explicit. Never alter a fuse outside a supervised facility. Never modify a detonation mechanism. Danny ignored every rule. He cut the fuse, then a second fuse, a third, a fourth. His hands stayed steady. They remembered the coal mines, the blasts in tight tunnels with water rising around his boots. By the time he finished, his hands were black with powder residue, and the mines were ready. At 2:30 a.m., Danny Reeves crawled forward alone into the darkness. The German positions were quiet, too quiet. No lanterns, no voices, just the cold creak of old wood in the farmhouse ahead. Rain from the previous night had turned the ground soft. Every movement sounded impossibly loud to him, cloth brushing grass, gear shifting, his own breathing pounding in his ears. He moved inch by inch, using every depression in the earth, every crater blasted into the soil over the past week. It took nearly 40 minutes to crawl less than 200 yards. By the time he reached a collapsed stone wall 50 yards from the farmhouse, his knees were numb and his elbows raw. 2 sniper rifles poked out from the upper windows of the second floor. He couldn't see the Germans, but he could see the occasional glint of metal when moonlight hit the barrels just right. Danny slid his pack open, unwrapped the first shoe mine, and located the shortened fuse igniter. His heartbeat wasn't fear. Not exactly. It felt like the heavy electric focus he'd felt underground when a charge had to be set fast or men would suffocate. He struck the igniter against the stone. A spark, a quick hiss, 3 seconds. He rose to a crouch, wound his shoulder back like a pitcher on a dusty mound, and hurled the mine with everything he had. The dark shape spun through the night, vanishing into the farmhouse window. 2 seconds later, the explosion ripped the quiet wide open. Light filled the second floor as the blast blew out planks, furniture, and bodies. Smoke burst through the windows and spiraled upward into the cold air. German voices immediately shouted in confusion. Danny was already unwrapping the second mine. He yanked the fuse to life, adjusted his stance, and threw again. This throw was even cleaner, a near-perfect line drive straight into the opposite window. The second explosion finished the job. The entire upper floor lurched, sagged, then collapsed inward in a frenzy of flames and splintered beams. The farmhouse was no longer a defensive position. It was a furnace. That left the sniper in the church tower. The distance was far greater, nearly 180 yards, and the angle was brutal. The window slit of the tower was narrow, barely wide enough for a rifle barrel. But the sniper up top had heard the blasts. He would be looking toward the burning farmhouse, trying to understand what had just turned night into daylight. Danny sprinted low toward a drainage ditch that cut at an angle toward the church. His boots splashed through standing water as he lunged into the ditch, using the shallow trench as cover to close the distance. When the ditch ended, he crawled again, painfully slow, painfully exposed, moving across terrain lit only by moonlight and firelight from the farmhouse ruins. If the sniper happened to glance down at the ground instead of the flames, Danny would simply disappear from the war. But no shot came. Everyone was staring at the blaze behind him. He reached a burned-out tractor 70 yards from the church tower, the closest cover he was likely to get. He unwrapped the third mine, lit the fuse, raised his arm. This throw had to be perfect. More arc, more height, more spin. It was the kind of impossible throw he'd practiced as a kid, hurling rocks at birds near the mine entrance, rarely hitting them, but learning how to shape a throw exactly where he wanted it. He launched the mine skyward. It rose high, turning end over end, then began to fall toward the tower window. For a second, Danny felt the crushing certainty he'd misjudged the angle, that the mine would strike the wall, bounce off, and detonate at his feet. But the spinning shadow slipped through the tower opening perfectly. The explosion blew out all four sides of the bell tower at once. The bell itself let out one broken chime before it crashed through the roof below. The sniper never fired again. Danny stayed frozen for a moment, watching the flames curl up through the tower. 3 targets, 3 throws, 3 hits. He turned and nearly reached for his carbine. 5 figures were standing behind him in the half-light. Lieutenant Mackey, Captain Rhodes, and 4 stunned infantrymen. Mackey spoke first. "Reeves, what in God's name did you just do?" Danny looked at the burning buildings, then back at his lieutenant. "My job, sir, removing obstacles." Rhodes stepped forward, face unreadable. For a long stretch he said nothing, only stared at the collapsing church tower as if trying to understand how one man had caused it. Finally he turned. "Sergeant Williams, make a note. Private Reeves reports to battalion headquarters at 0700 hours. Danny's stomach tightened. That was it. The court-martial, the charges, the end of everything. Then Lieutenant Mackey spoke, his voice almost amused. "Begging the captain's pardon, sir, but I think Private Reeves deserves a medal, and maybe a training assignment." Rhodes didn't answer immediately. He watched the fire for a moment longer. "Headquarters will decide," he finally said. "Dismissed." The next morning, exactly at 9:47 a.m., the company advanced across the open ground. Not a single shot came from the German positions. 47 men crossed safely. 0 casualties. Danny walked with them silently, already thinking about the meeting ahead, and the consequences waiting for him at headquarters. At 0700, Danny Reeves stood outside the battalion headquarters tent, uniform still stiff with dried mud from the night before, hands faintly smelling of explosive powder, no matter how hard he'd scrubbed. Inside, he could hear muffled voices. Captain Rhodes, Lieutenant Mackey, and a third man with a deeper tone that Reeves didn't recognize. The conversation sounded tense, like officers arguing over a problem none of them wanted to own. A sergeant finally pulled open the tent flap and gestured him in. The command tent was cramped, dimly lit by a single kerosene lamp, even though morning sunlight was leaking through the canvas walls. Captain Rhodes sat behind a folding table buried under reports and maps. Mackey stood to one side, like a man both proud and worried. Beside them was a Major Reeves had never seen. Older, broad-shouldered, with a Purple Heart ribbon and a combat infantry badge that said he'd seen more than enough bad days in the field. "Private Reeves," Rhodes said formally. "This is Major Ricks, 3rd Army Combat Engineering Division." Danny snapped a salute. Ricks returned it with a more casual one. "At ease, son," he said. "I've been hearing some very unusual things about your activities last night." The major lifted a sheet from the table, Mackey's report. He read aloud in a slow, even voice. 3 sniper positions eliminated. 0 friendly casualties. Method: captured German shoe mines deployed by manual throw with shortened fuses. He lowered the paper and stared at Reeves. "That sound about right?" "Yes, sir." "You understand tampering with explosive devices is a court-martial offense?" "Yes, sir." "You also realize that using captured enemy equipment without authorization violates multiple Army regulations?" "Yes, sir." "And performing an unsanctioned night assault without proper command approval can legally be classified as abandoning your position." Danny swallowed. "Sir, Lieutenant Mackey authorized the neutralization of the positions." "He did," Ricks agreed. "But he did not authorize you to modify explosives, violate half the safety rules in the manual, or invent an entirely new combat technique not written anywhere in U.S. doctrine since 1918. Reeves stayed silent. This was all unfolding exactly the way he had expected. Captain Rhodes stepped in. "Major, if I may, Private Reeves saved 47 men yesterday. His methods were irregular, but the outcome is undeniable." "I'm not disputing the results," Ricks replied. "I'm questioning whether we want every private in the Army experimenting with explosives in the middle of combat. What happens when the next one blows himself and his squad to pieces?" Lieutenant Mackey cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, we've been using the same static mine doctrine since the Great War. The Germans have outgrown it. They read our patterns. They step around them. Maybe it's time we explore a little innovation." Major Ricks turned his attention fully toward Danny. "Where'd you learn to throw like that, son?" "Scranton coal mines, sir. Used to throw rocks at rats. Played some baseball in high school." "And modifying an explosive fuse. Where'd that come from?" "Same place, sir. Setting charges in mine shafts. You learn fuse timing pretty carefully when the ceiling is threatening to drop on your head." Ricks nodded slowly. Then a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Gentlemen," he said, "I'm about to make a decision that may earn me a reprimand from division headquarters." He looked straight at Captain Rhodes. "You are not court-martialing this man. You're recommending him for promotion to corporal and assigning him to training duties." Rhodes blinked in surprise. "Sir," Ricks cut him off. "Captain, we are losing this war on innovation. The Germans adapt faster than we do. They experiment. We cling to manuals older than half the men using them. If we want to win, we need soldiers who think like Reeves, men who solve problems instead of waiting for Paris to update the doctrine. Then he faced Danny. "Here's what's going to happen, Corporal Reeves." Danny's breath caught. "Corporal, you're going to spend the next 2 weeks teaching your technique to every combat engineer in 3rd Army. You will demonstrate it, document it, and instruct them on fuse modification, throw mechanics, approach tactics, and safety protocols." Danny hesitated. "Sir, I'm not exactly a teacher." "You're a miner who figured out how to take out 3 sniper positions with captured mines and a good throwing arm," Ricks said. "That makes you more qualified than half the instructors at Fort Belvoir." He stepped toward the exit, then paused. "One last thing. Don't ever modify explosives without authorization again. If you have new ideas, you bring them to Lieutenant Mackey first. If you freelance like that another time, I'll personally see that you spend the rest of the war cleaning latrines in Casablanca. Clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." Ricks left the tent. Rhodes looked at Danny with an expression caught somewhere between irritation and reluctant respect. "Dismissed, Corporal. Get your training notes written." Danny stepped out into the morning sunlight, head spinning at how quickly his world had changed. Court-martial 1 minute, promotion the next. 2 weeks turned into 4. 4 weeks into 6. Reeves spent every day standing in front of groups of combat engineers, demonstrating the technique on a makeshift range, teaching trajectory, timing, and fuse handling with careful, almost surgical precision. At first, the men scoffed. Mines thrown by hand? Ridiculous. Not doctrine, not in the manual. Then Danny lit a fuse, launched a mine 70 yards, threaded it through a target window, and let the explosion speak for him. Skepticism evaporated instantly. Within a month, more than 20 engineers could perform the technique reliably. By May, nearly 50. Reports of successful combat deployments began flooding in. By late April, the reports were arriving almost daily. Machine gun nests destroyed with pinpoint throws, observation posts collapsed, snipers eliminated in seconds. April 9th. Corporal James Donnelly used the technique to silence a German machine gun crew that had stalled 2 infantry companies near Kassel. 3 throws, 3 direct hits. 36 men crossed safely. April 23rd, Sergeant Paul Martinez leveled a fortified observation post that had been directing brutal artillery strikes onto American positions. 2 mines, 2 detonations. The German coordination collapsed instantly. May 2nd, Private Eddie Russo eliminated a sniper who had been killing Americans for 3 straight days from an upper floor of a bombed-out factory. 1 throw, 1 explosion. Word spread through engineer units almost like rumor or folklore. A technique born from desperation, carried from soldier to soldier, quietly rewriting the playbook the Army had used for decades. And the Germans noticed. May 7th, American intelligence intercepted a German radio transmission from a Wehrmacht unit near Leipzig. Americans deploying explosives by unusual manual method. Hand-thrown mines with immediate detonation. Recommend caution in elevated positions. A week later, a captured German lieutenant admitted his unit had been ordered to avoid windowed defensive posts entirely after several American mine infiltration attacks. Psychologically, the effect was enormous. Positions once considered safe were suddenly death traps. Germans no longer trusted elevated sniper nests. They abandoned key buildings at the rumor that American engineers operated nearby. But official recognition from the U.S. Army lagged far behind the field's success. The Combat Engineering Division wrote up formal reports, analysis papers, and new procedures. They named the technique Mobile Mine Deployment Method, a dry, bureaucratic phrase stripped of the blood and urgency that created it. In an appendix, only a single paragraph mentioned its origin. Initial development attributed to Corporal Daniel Reeves, 23rd Combat Engineer Battalion, March 1945. No medal, no ceremony, just a footnote. Danny didn't mind. Recognition had stopped mattering the day Tommy Sullivan died following the rules. On May 8th, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was finally over. Danny stood in a dusty French square with the rest of his battalion, listening to the announcement crackle through a field radio while men cheered, hugged, cried, and got drunk on whatever bottles they could find. Danny didn't celebrate much. Victory was good, but victory doesn't bring anyone back. Demobilization began in June. Based on service points, Danny qualified to return home by July. Before he left, Major Ricks found him one last time. "Heading back to Pennsylvania?" "Yes, sir, going back to the mines." "You ever consider staying in?" Ricks asked. "We could use men who think differently." Danny shook his head. "No, sir, I've done my part." Ricks handed him an envelope. "Your discharge papers, and something else." Inside was a one-page commendation on 3rd Army letterhead. Official recognition for innovative tactical development. It wasn't a medal, but it was in his service record, evidence that he'd been more than just a coal miner with a strong arm. Danny folded it carefully. "Thank you, sir." "You saved a lot of lives," Ricks said quietly. "That matters more than any medal." They shook hands. Danny boarded the transport trucks that would take him toward the coast and then finally home. He never saw Major Ricks again. Danny returned to Scranton in August 1945. The coal mine rehired him as blasting foreman, the same job he'd held before the war. The work was familiar, predictable, even comforting. He rarely spoke about his service. If someone asked, he'd just say he'd been a combat engineer and did some demolition work. That was enough. Only one person knew the whole story. Lieutenant Mackey. They exchanged letters for a few years. Mackey wrote from Fort Belvoir, training the next generation of engineers. Danny wrote about coal seams and blasting schedules. Eventually, the correspondence faded. In 1947, Danny married a girl from Wilkes Barre named Catherine. They had 3 children. He taught them to throw balls with perfect technique, never saying why it mattered so much. In 1952, the Army released a new field manual for combat engineers. Section 7, subsection C, described offensive mine deployment with clinical precision. It contained every step Danny had invented. It did not mention his name, and he wouldn't have cared anyway. By the late 1950s, the technique spread to the Marine Corps, then to NATO allies, then to militaries around the world. By 1960, it was standard doctrine in 17 countries. No one remembered where it came from. No one needed to. Danny Reeves died in 1994 at age 71, lung cancer from decades of coal dust. His obituary in the Scranton Times mentioned his service in the war, his years in the mines, and his family. 3 children, 7 grandchildren. It did not mention that he had invented a battlefield technique that saved hundreds of lives. In 2003, a historian at West Point researching obscure engineering innovations found a forgotten wartime report. Buried in an appendix was a single paragraph about Corporal Daniel Reeves. The historian traced the entire story through interviews, after-action notes, and scattered training documents. He published it in a small academic journal. 43 people read it. One of them was Danny's grandson. He had never known his quiet grandfather had done anything extraordinary during the war. To him, the old man had just been Grandpa, steady, kind, good with tools. He drove to Scranton, visited the cemetery, and stood before a simple granite headstone. Daniel Reeves, 1923-1994, beloved father and husband. He thought about 47 men crossing a deadly field safely. He pictured 3 perfect throws cutting through the night air. He imagined rules broken so that others could live. He didn't add anything to the headstone. It was already right. Some men change wars quietly. Some innovations spread without names attached. Some heroes die without recognition. That does not make them any less important.